The room fell silent as Emily's voice sliced through the air, mocking me. "How does it feel being the most useless one here, Sarah?" The laughter of my family echoed in my ears, but it was the last straw. For years I had been the invisible one, the one who silently fixed everything. But tonight I wasn't going to take it anymore. With a calm but sharp tone, I looked her in the eyes and asked, "How does it feel when this useless one stops paying your bills?" The room froze, and in that moment everything changed. Sarah, 30 years old, had built a life that appeared calm and calculated. As a freelance financial analyst, she worked tirelessly from the quiet apartment she had in Charleston, West Virginia. Despite her success, there was something missing. It wasn't her career or her independence, but something much deeper, a feeling of being unseen, unappreciated, and ultimately abandoned. In a family where attention was reserved for the loudest and most charming, Sarah had learned to fade into the background. Every family gathering, every celebration, Sarah would take her place at the table with a silent, almost invisible grace. Her role had always been that of the quiet provider. While her parents and her older sister Emily spoke loudly and often about their triumphs, Sarah was the one who kept the financial wheels turning in the background. When bills piled up, Sarah was the one who quietly paid them. When her parents struggled to make ends meet, Sarah was the one who covered their rent, their groceries, and even the utilities. She never asked for recognition. It was just who she was, always supporting, never taking. Yet, despite her sacrifices, Sarah's efforts went unnoticed. Emily, her older sister by 2 years, was the family favourite, the one who received all the praise, all the attention. Emily was loud, outgoing, and always the life of the party. She had built a life that was picturesque to anyone who looked at it from the outside. Married with 2 children, a successful business, and an ever-growing network of friends. Emily was the one everyone admired, the one who made everyone laugh, the one who had everything. And then there was Sarah, the one who was just there. It wasn't that Sarah disliked her sister, far from it. She admired Emily's energy, her ability to take up space in the world without hesitation. But Sarah had always been the opposite, quiet, reserved, and more comfortable behind a desk than at the centre of a room. She'd learned early on to keep her head down, to be the one who fixed problems without asking for anything in return. It had become second nature for Sarah to carry the financial and emotional burden of her family, and yet it had always been at the cost of her own dreams. Emily, on the other hand, had never had to worry about money. She had always been the golden child in the family, the one who could do no wrong. She went to an expensive private school, had every opportunity handed to her, and even though she'd had her share of financial struggles, those were always short-lived. Her life was never burdened by the weight that Sarah had carried for so many years. And now, at 30, Sarah found herself wondering if her sacrifices had been in vain. It was at this very moment, during the anniversary dinner for their parents, that Sarah's patience would finally snap. She had been quiet throughout the evening, just as she always was, listening to the laughter and chatter around the table. Her mother passed around plates of food, her father smiled and cracked jokes, and Emily basked in the attention, recounting her latest business successes. All was as it always had been. Sarah sat back in her chair, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had helped put that food on the table, helped pay for the restaurant, the drinks, the decorations. No one noticed, no one said thank you. The bitterness had been simmering for years, and now, at this very moment, it began to boil over. "How does it feel being the most useless one here, Sarah?" Emily's voice broke through the pleasant chatter of the table, sharp and cutting. It was as if the room had gone still, but Sarah's heart raced. The smirk on Emily's face made it clear that her words were meant to sting. And they did. They always did. But this time something inside Sarah shifted. For years, she had swallowed her pain, her frustration, always putting family first, never asking for anything in return. But that mocking question, spoken in front of their parents and cousins, was the last straw. Sarah's hand clenched around her glass, the coldness of the wine almost comforting. She could have stayed silent, as she always did. She could have let the insult slide off her like water on a duck's back. But this time, Sarah was tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of being the one who carried the weight for everyone else, tired of being the useless one. She wasn't just going to sit here and take it anymore. She straightened in her chair, looking Emily directly in the eye. The words that came out of her mouth were calm but razor sharp. "How does it feel when this useless one stops paying your bills?" The table went silent. Emily's smile faltered, her eyes widening in shock. The laughter that had filled the room just moments ago was now replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Their parents exchanged glances, their faces frozen in disbelief. The cousins, who had always seen Sarah as the quiet, reliable one, looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Sarah felt the weight of every word she'd ever held back in that one moment. The laughter around the table was deafening, almost as if Emily's cruel words had never been spoken. Sarah, however, could hear the sting in her sister's voice long after the words had left her lips. "How does it feel being the most useless one here, Sarah?" Emily had said, her tone dripping with mockery. The words had been casual, as if Emily was simply stating a fact, not knowing the damage they caused. For years, Sarah had let her sister's remarks slide. She had always been the quiet one, the one who picked up the pieces of their broken family, who silently took on the burden of paying bills, covering expenses and keeping things running smoothly. Yet despite all of this, her efforts were never recognised. Emily was the one who got the accolades, the one who made everyone laugh, the one everyone admired. And Sarah? She was the silent fixer who was always overlooked, taken for granted. But that night, at their parents' 36th anniversary dinner, something inside Sarah snapped. She sat still for a moment, trying to let the laughter fade into the background, trying to convince herself that she could just let this moment pass as she always had. She could keep quiet. She could bury the hurt, let Emily have her moment and pretend it didn't bother her. But that nagging, bitter feeling inside her grew louder and louder, suffocating her. No more. No more of this quiet suffering, no more being the family's unpaid therapist and financial lifeline. Sarah shifted in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand tightened around the glass of wine in front of her, the coolness of it offering a brief sense of calm. The warmth of the room, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. Everything felt distant now. She was no longer just sitting there, quietly taking in the words and the looks. Tonight she was going to make them see her, really see her for the first time in years. "How does it feel when this useless one stops paying your bills?" The words left Sarah's lips before she could even stop herself. She didn't shout, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with calm precision, a quiet but unyielding force. The silence that followed her statement was more deafening than any laughter could have ever been. For a brief moment, Sarah's eyes met Emily's. Her sister's smirk faltered, the expression of superiority slipping from her face as confusion flickered in her eyes. The family, who had been so quick to laugh at Sarah's expense just moments ago, now sat in stunned silence. Her parents, her cousins, and even Emily's husband, all of them looked at Sarah as though she had just revealed something they had never seen before. Her father, who had always been the one to joke about Sarah's boring job, sat motionless, his glass of wine halfway to his lips. Her mother's smile, which had been so warm just moments ago, had now vanished, replaced with a look of discomfort. Emily, still in shock, stammered, What are you talking about?" Her voice, usually so confident and commanding, now trembled slightly as she glanced at her husband, seeking validation. But she couldn't find it. No one spoke. No one moved. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound that broke through the silence. She could feel their eyes on her, could feel the weight of their collective gaze. But she didn't look away. For the first time, she was finally forcing them to see her, to see the years of invisible labour, of financial sacrifices, of emotional exhaustion that had gone unnoticed. "I've been holding this family together for years, Emily," Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with the weight of years of pent-up frustration. "When you needed money to fix your store, I bailed you out. When Mom and Dad couldn't pay the utility bills, I paid them. When you wanted to send your kids to private school, I paid the tuition. You never saw it. None of you ever did." The room was utterly still. Her father's face had hardened, and her mother's hands trembled as she adjusted the plates in front of her. Her cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of where to look. Emily, now pale, sputtered in disbelief. "You're lying," Emily said, her voice cracking. "You're just making this up to look important." Sarah shook her head slowly, a small, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "No, Emily, I'm not lying. You can check your bank statements. The money I sent, the loans I took out to keep your store afloat, they're all there. I've been paying your way while you made fun of my useless office job. I've done more for this family than anyone ever cared to see, and I'm done." Emily's face flushed with anger, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, fear. For the first time, Sarah saw it. The realization that she couldn't just keep asking for money, for help, for support, without acknowledging the cost it had been to Sarah. But Emily wasn't ready to accept it yet. She wasn't ready to admit that her sister had been quietly bearing the weight of their family's burdens all along. "You're pathetic, Sarah," Emily spat, her voice low and venomous. "You think you're some hero for throwing this in our faces? You're nothing without us." "Maybe I am nothing without you," Sarah said softly, her voice steady despite the sting of her sister's words. "But I'm something with myself, and that's all I need." With that, Sarah turned and walked toward the door. Her family remained in silence, their expressions frozen in shock and discomfort. Sarah didn't look back. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done, the truth had been laid bare, and for the first time in her life, she was free. As Sarah sat quietly in her apartment, the weight of the evening's confrontation slowly began to settle into her chest. The dinner, the words exchanged, the way everything had changed in a moment. It was all so overwhelming. But it wasn't new. The years of quiet sacrifice, of putting her own dreams on hold for the sake of her family, had been leading to this point. And now, as she looked back, she realized how long she had been invisible in the eyes of those who should have loved her most. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift back in time, to the days when she was just a teenager, struggling to make ends meet. She was only 14 when she first realized that the world wasn't going to hand her anything. Life in Charleston, West Virginia, had never been easy, but the weight of responsibility fell heavily on Sarah's shoulders at an age when most of her friends were still focused on school dances and weekend plans. She had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't ask for much, but that didn't mean she wasn't paying attention. Sarah saw the tension between her parents as they struggled with bills. She overheard late-night whispers about mounting debt and looming shut-off notices. Emily, her older sister, was oblivious to all of it, too busy with cheerleading and socializing to notice the strain their parents were under. Sarah, however, couldn't ignore it, and she couldn't stand by while her family suffered. At the age of 14, she took her first job, waiting tables at a small diner on Kana Boulevard. It wasn't glamorous work, far from it. The smell of burnt coffee and grease clung to her clothes, and the tips were small. But every dollar she earned went straight into her savings. It wasn't for a dream vacation or for anything fun, it was for the bills. The power had been turned off more times than she could count, and Sarah knew that if things didn't change, it would happen again. The moment she handed her mother $300 of her savings to pay the overdue bill was the moment Sarah understood the sacrifice she had made. She remembered the soft voice of her mother as she tried to refuse the money, but Sarah wouldn't hear of it. "It's okay," she had said, pushing the money into her hands. "I'll take care of it." And for the first time, she realized that her childhood was slipping away. She was no longer just a kid. She was the fixer. Her father had given her a weak smile, calling her dependable. But Sarah knew it was more than that. She was the one holding things together, but it felt like she was the only one who saw it. Emily, still in high school, didn't seem to understand the pressure their parents were under. Sarah often found herself lying awake at night, wondering why she was the only one who seemed to care about the family's well-being. By the time Sarah was 16, things had only gotten worse. Her father's truck broke down and he couldn't afford the repairs. Again, it was Sarah who stepped up. With $400 of her hard-earned money, she paid for the fix, never asking for anything in return. Her father had patted her on the head, giving her a half-hearted compliment, but there was no recognition for the emotional toll it took on her. Sarah's mother had smiled weakly and murmured, "You're helping us so much," but it never felt like enough. Emily was still wrapped up in her high school life, planning for prom, going to parties. Sarah was stuck with the responsibilities that no one else seemed to notice. At 18, Sarah had hoped for an escape. She had earned a partial scholarship to a college in Boston, a dream she had worked for, until Emily's financial problems forced Sarah to stay. Emily had made the mistake of choosing an expensive private school, one that left her buried in student loan debt. Their parents couldn't help, and Sarah knew that she was the only one who could. Despite the scholarship, she stayed behind, enrolling at the local community college to help pay off Emily's debts. The $2,000 Sarah had saved from waitressing and side jobs went to help pay off Emily's loans. Emily graduated with a degree she never used, while Sarah was left juggling night classes and 2 jobs just to keep everything afloat. Emily never said thank you, and their parents barely noticed. Years passed, and Sarah continued to support her family in silence. Leslie's kids went to private schools, and Sarah bought their school supplies, backpacks, and even a graphing calculator for her eldest niece. She paid for their utilities when they couldn't afford it. She covered repair costs, gave them money to tide them over, all without ever hearing a word of thanks. Every Sunday dinner, Sarah would sit in the background, her family oblivious to the sacrifices she made. They praised Emily's perfect life, her perfect family, and her perfect career. Sarah was just the silent one, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly, and the one who received no acknowledgement. As Sarah approached her late 20s, she began to wonder if she would ever get a chance to live her own life. Her dreams of going to Boston had long been forgotten, her desires pushed aside for the sake of keeping the family's wheels turning. She had built a successful career as a freelance financial analyst, but all of her achievements felt hollow. No one saw them. No one recognized how much she had given up, how much she had sacrificed to keep everything intact. The weight of it all began to suffocate Sarah. She had spent her life paying for everyone else's mistakes, but who was paying for hers? Who was holding her up? The answer, as it had always been, was no one. As the years passed, Sarah's perception of her place in the family began to shift. She had always thought that her sacrifices would be recognized eventually, that one day her family would acknowledge all that she had done to hold them together. But that day never came. Instead, she began to realize that her role in the family was nothing more than a silent, invisible provider. They didn't see her as a person with her own dreams, her own needs, or even her own life. To them, she was just the fixer, the one who always stepped in when things went wrong, the one who was relied upon to keep the family afloat. The more she thought about it, the more the truth hit her like a ton of bricks. Sarah had spent her entire life doing for them. Every paycheck she earned went toward paying off someone else's debts. Every personal dream she had was set aside so she could take care of family crises. Yet not once had anyone ever stepped forward to say, "Thank you, Sarah, we appreciate you." Not once had they seen her as anything more than the person who could always be counted on to help them out of a jam. The realization stung. It was a bitter, painful truth she had been avoiding for so long. Sarah had allowed herself to be used, no, to be taken for granted, and all because she thought that her family's happiness and well-being mattered more than her own. She thought that if she just kept giving, kept doing, eventually they would see her. But now, after all these years, she saw the reality. They didn't see her. They only saw what she could do for them. It wasn't just her sister Emily either, it was her parents too. Her mother, who always smiled and patted her shoulder when she handed over money, never once asked if Sarah was okay. Her father, who had called her dependable, never acknowledged the cost of Sarah's sacrifice. They simply took, and Sarah let them. But the most painful part of it all wasn't just the lack of recognition, it was the betrayal. The moment Sarah realised that the very person she had always tried to protect, the one she had bent over backward to help, had used her trust against her. It came when Emily needed a loan to keep her business afloat. It wasn't the first time Emily had asked for help. Sarah had loaned her money before without hesitation, because that's what she did. She had always put Emily's needs ahead of her own. But this time, there was something different about Emily's request. Emily told Sarah that she needed a large sum of money to pay off an emergency supplier bill for her struggling online clothing store. It was a hefty amount, and Sarah was unsure about lending it, but Emily assured her that she would pay her back. "Don't worry," she'd said with that charming smile of hers. "I've got this under control." So, as always, Sarah opened up her savings account and transferred the money to Emily's business. It was $5,000, more than Sarah could afford, but she did it because she couldn't stand the thought of Emily's business failing. That night, Sarah went to bed feeling uneasy, but hopeful that things would get better for her sister. A few weeks passed, and Emily never mentioned the loan again. Sarah tried to bring it up, asking when Emily would start paying her back, but Emily brushed her off. "I'm still working on things," she'd say. But the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into silence. It wasn't until Sarah dug into her personal finances one evening, as she was reviewing her monthly statements, that she stumbled upon the truth. Emily hadn't just ignored the loan, she had been using Sarah's money for her personal expenses. The payments Sarah had made to help her sister's business had been misused. Emily had taken the money meant to pay for the business's debt and funneled it into her own pocket, spending it on luxury items and vacations. The realization hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She had been duped. The very person she had worked to protect had turned her back on her, using her for her own benefit. The emotional toll was worse than any financial loss. Emily had betrayed her, and Sarah now understood that all her efforts, all her sacrifices, had been in vain. Sarah felt a wave of anger and disbelief flood through her. How could Emily do this to her? How could the sister she had always supported and cared for turn her back on her in such a cold and calculated way? The trust Sarah had given so freely was shattered, and she found herself asking, what had she been doing all these years? Was she just a tool to be used? A financial safety net that everyone could lean on when they were in trouble? The people who should have been her biggest supporters were the very ones who had taken advantage of her. In that moment, Sarah realized that her sacrifices had been futile. She had spent years building a life for her family, but she had neglected to build one for herself. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt as though she could finally see clearly. Her life had been spent holding up the weight of others, but now she was done. She would no longer be the one to carry their burdens. She would no longer be the invisible one. The tears she had held back for years finally spilled over as she sat alone in her apartment. But they were no longer tears of frustration or hurt. They were tears of release, of freedom. She had been carrying their weight for too long. It was time for Sarah to carry herself. The days after the confrontation at the anniversary dinner felt like a blur to Sarah. The words she had said, the way her family had looked at her, were still echoing in her mind. She had walked out of that room, leaving behind stunned silence, but inside there was a sense of clarity she had never felt before. She had spent years trapped in a cycle of giving, and for the first time, she had chosen to break free. For years, Sarah had been the silent fixer, the one who kept things together while everyone else took the credit. But now, with Emily's betrayal and the years of unnoticed sacrifices weighing heavily on her, Sarah realised something. She was no longer going to be the family's crutch. She wasn't going to help them solve their problems anymore. She was done. The decision to cut off all financial support wasn't easy. It wasn't just about money. It was about her sense of self-worth. Her need to finally be seen for who she was, and not just for what she could provide. She had given everything for her family, only to be dismissed and taken for granted. Emily's harsh words, her family's indifference, had finally opened her eyes. It started slowly. Sarah stopped answering her parents' calls when they asked for money, stopped agreeing to cover the bills when they were short. At first it felt unnatural, as though she was betraying them. But the more she did it, the more she felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't their unpaid helper anymore. She wasn't the one who had to carry them. But the isolation quickly set in. No one understood why she was acting this way. Her mother, her father, both of them were bewildered by her refusal to help. They didn't see the years of sacrifice. They didn't see how Sarah had kept the family afloat while they carried on with their lives. To them, she was just being stubborn, difficult. Emily, too, was furious. She didn't understand why Sarah had stopped being the reliable one. She called, texted, and even showed up at Sarah's apartment, demanding answers. "Why won't you help me?" she asked, voice dripping with frustration. "You're being selfish. Don't you want to help your family?" It was the same tone Emily had used all their lives, the tone that implied that Sarah had no choice but to help, no choice but to take on the burdens that no one else wanted. Emily had always assumed that Sarah would be there, always ready to rescue her. And now that Sarah was pulling away, Emily couldn't understand why. To her, family meant sacrifice, but it had always been Sarah who sacrificed. Emily had never once had to give up anything for anyone. Sarah's phone buzzed late one evening, and when she looked at the screen, it was her father's name. She felt a pit form in her stomach, but answered anyway. She could feel his disappointment through the phone, even before he spoke. "Sarah, what's going on? Your mother and I are worried about you. You've always been the one we could rely on. Why are you pushing us away now?" His voice sounded so tired, so familiar, and yet Sarah felt a coldness seep into her chest. She had been the one they always relied on, but no one had ever once stopped to ask if she was okay. No one had ever cared about the cost to her, emotionally, physically, or financially. The realization hit Sarah like a freight train. She had spent years trying to keep this family together, but they hadn't even seen her as a person with her own needs. They had only seen her as the one who could make things work. "I'm not pushing you away, Dad," she said softly, but her voice was firm. "I'm just not going to keep doing this anymore. I've been doing everything for you guys, and it's not been enough. I'm tired." There was a long pause on the other end. Her father's sigh seemed to echo through the silence, and Sarah's chest tightened. She had always been the good daughter, the dependable one, and now she was the one who was considered selfish for standing up for herself. "I don't understand, Sarah," her father finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've always helped. You've always been there for us, and now you're just walking away. You're abandoning your family." His words were like a knife to the heart. Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her, but she pushed it away. She wasn't abandoning anyone. She was choosing herself, for the first time in her life, choosing to stop being the invisible one, the one who fixed everything, while everyone else carried on without a second thought. "It's not abandonment, Dad. It's about me finally having a chance to live my life. You and Mum, Emily, you've all been taking, and I've been giving, but I'm done. I've given enough." There was silence again, this time thicker, heavier. She could feel her father's disappointment radiating through the phone. But she also felt something else, relief. Finally, she was being honest. Finally, she was speaking her truth. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. "You need to learn how to stand on your own. I'm not going to be the one who carries you." Her father said nothing more. He simply hung up. The phone calls started immediately after Sarah's conversation with her father. It had only been a few hours since the dinner, and already her family was trying to pull her back into the same cycle she had just broken. Emily was the first to call. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "Sarah, this isn't like you," Emily began, her voice thick with frustration. "You've always been the one who helped. Why are you doing this now? This isn't you. I need you. The business is falling apart and I can't do this alone." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of her sister's words pressing heavily on her chest. Emily's neediness, her reliance on Sarah for everything, had always been a constant. But this felt different. Emily wasn't just asking for help. She was demanding it, as if Sarah owed her something. "I can't keep doing this, Emily," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been doing this for years and it's never been enough. You never even acknowledge it. You just take and take. I'm done." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so thick that Sarah could almost hear the shock in her sister's breath. "You're really going to leave me hanging, Sarah?" Emily's voice trembled slightly. "You're really going to walk away when everything is falling apart? What kind of sister does that?" "I'm not walking away from you, Emily," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I'm walking away from being the one who holds everything together for you while you do nothing. I've spent my entire life fixing your mistakes, paying your bills, supporting you when you needed it. I'm not doing it anymore." Emily's response was sharp and biting. "Fine," she spat. "If that's the way it is, then you can forget about being part of this family. Don't come crying to me when you realise what you've lost." And with that, Emily hung up. But the phone didn't stop ringing. Within minutes, Sarah's mother called, her voice trembling with concern. "Sarah, what's going on? We've never had problems like this before. Why won't you help your sister? Why won't you help the family?" her mother asked, her words laced with confusion and hurt. Sarah felt a pang in her heart as she listened to her mother's voice. She had always tried to be the perfect daughter, the one who could be relied upon without question. But now, it seemed, even her mother didn't understand. Her own mother was asking her to go back to the role she had been playing for years, the invisible one, the fixer. "Mum," Sarah began, her voice softer this time, though still firm, "I've been doing this for so long. I've been the one to support everyone, financially, emotionally, and I've never asked for anything in return. But no one ever saw it. I'm not doing it anymore. I can't. It's not healthy for me, and it's not healthy for you either." Her mother's voice wavered. "But Sarah, this isn't like you. You've always been the one to help. You've always been the strong one. Don't you want to fix things?" "I have been the one to fix things, Mum," Sarah said, feeling her chest tighten with emotion. "But I'm not fixing things anymore. I'm fixing myself. I need to do this for me. I need to take care of myself for once. I'm done being everyone's safety net." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could feel the weight of her mother's disappointment, but she stood her ground. "I don't understand, Sarah. I don't understand why you're doing this," her mother said quietly. "You're our daughter. We've always needed you. You can't just walk away." "I'm not walking away, Mum. I'm stepping back. I need to live my life for me, and I can't do that if I'm constantly being relied on to fix everyone else's problems." Her mother's response was a mixture of sadness and anger. "You're being selfish," she said, her voice breaking. "You're abandoning us." "I'm not abandoning you," Sarah said, shaking her head, though her mother couldn't see. "I'm choosing myself for once. I'm choosing to be free of this." Before her mother could respond, Sarah hung up. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her own well-being. As Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, the phone began to buzz again. This time it was her father, the one person who, despite everything, had always been there for her. She hesitated before answering, but then took a deep breath. "Sarah," her father's voice came through the phone, sounding strained. "What's going on? Why are you doing this? Why can't you just help us out like you always have?" "I've helped for years, Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice steady. "I've given everything I have, and it's never been enough. I'm not doing it anymore. I can't keep carrying all of you." "You're breaking our family apart, Sarah," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're all we've had. We're not like you. We need you." "You've always needed me, Dad, but I need me too," Sarah replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to live my own life, and I can't do that if I'm always carrying everyone else's burdens." "I don't know what to say to you," her father said, his voice low. "You're being so selfish." "I'm not being selfish, Dad," Sarah said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I'm finally choosing to be the person I've always needed to be." With that, she hung up, feeling the finality of her decision settle over her. The phone call stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. The days that followed Sarah's decision to distance herself from her family felt like an emotional roller coaster. The silence was almost suffocating. Her phone remained eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the constant buzzing of calls and messages that had once flooded her life. For the first time, Sarah was alone, truly alone. And at first, the isolation was crushing. The absence of her family's voices, the lack of their demands and expectations, created an emptiness she had never felt before. She had always been the one to hold everything together, the one who ensured that her family's world didn't fall apart. Now that she had severed those ties, the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. Sarah spent long hours in her apartment, staring out the window at the world that seemed to go on without her. At times, she doubted herself. Had she made a mistake? Was she truly selfish for wanting to live her own life, for wanting to exist outside of the roles her family had imposed on her? But slowly, something began to shift. She realized that for the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about anyone else. She could focus on herself. The freedom was terrifying at first, being responsible only for her own life. But over time, it started to feel like the most profound relief. Without the constant need to manage her family's crises, Sarah found herself with time she never thought she would have again. Time that was no longer spent paying bills, covering loans, or solving problems that weren't hers to solve. Sarah had always told herself that her sacrifices were necessary, that her family needed her. But now, as she looked around her quiet apartment, she saw that she needed herself too. She needed to live, to exist outside the expectations that had been forced upon her. It wasn't easy. The first few days were filled with uncertainty. She felt like a stranger in her own life, unsure of how to fill the space she had been given. But then, gradually, Sarah found herself doing things she had always wanted to do, but never had the time or energy for. One of the first things she rediscovered was her love for painting. As a child, Sarah had always found comfort in art. It was a way for her to express herself without having to speak. But over the years, between work and family obligations, painting had fallen by the wayside. Now, with time on her hands, Sarah pulled out the old easel and set it up in the corner of her apartment. She started with small sketches, tentative at first, unsure of how to begin again. But with each brushstroke, she felt a piece of herself return. For the first time in a long while, Sarah found herself smiling. The act of creating something beautiful, something entirely her own, felt like a declaration of independence. She wasn't just painting for the sake of it, she was painting to reclaim herself. Each canvas she completed was a step toward healing, a small act of rebellion against the years of sacrifice she had endured for others. Sarah also began to rediscover the joy of reading. She had always loved books, but in the past, she had read only when she could afford to carve out a few quiet minutes. Now she immersed herself in novels, letting her imagination wander to places it had never been before. She found herself staying up late, turning the pages of stories that didn't require her to save anyone, stories that only existed for her enjoyment. The most surprising change, however, came in Sarah's work. She had always been dedicated to her career as a freelance financial analyst, but now, without the weight of family responsibilities, she found herself excelling. She was more focused, more efficient. The stress that had once been a constant companion no longer loomed over her. She could think clearly, make decisions with confidence, and take on new projects with excitement. Her clients began to take notice. Sarah's reputation grew, and she found herself with more opportunities than she had ever dreamed of. But the true twist came when Sarah started to connect with others outside her family. She had always kept to herself, and her social circle had been limited to her family and a few colleagues. Now, with the freedom to choose her own company, Sarah began to meet new people. She started attending art classes, joined a book club, and even made plans to meet friends for coffee, something she had never had the time to do before. As she ventured into this new world, she realized how much she had been missing. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling art class, Sarah sat in a cafe sipping coffee with a new friend she had met at a local gallery. She had spent so many years giving, supporting, and sacrificing for her family that she had forgotten what it felt like to live for herself. But now, as she listened to her friend talk about her own passions and dreams, Sarah felt a sense of joy and freedom that was entirely new. Sarah realized in that moment that she was building a life for herself, a life where she wasn't defined by her family's expectations, where she wasn't just the fixer, the helper, the one who took on everyone else's burdens. She was becoming her own person again. And as she looked around the cafe at the people she was now beginning to connect with, she realized something else. She wasn't alone. Sarah's world was no longer just a reflection of her family's needs. It was her own, and she was beginning to see it in full color. For the first time in years, she was allowing herself to feel joy, to explore her own identity, and to create the life she had always wanted. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. As the weeks went by, Sarah began to feel the weight of her decision settling into her bones. The silence from her family was deafening. No calls, no messages, no attempts at reconciliation. She had expected this, knew it even, but it didn't make it easier. There was a part of her that missed them, that wished things could have turned out differently. But she knew deep down that the life she had been living, the one where she had always put everyone else first, was not sustainable. She had been drowning for too long. She spent the days focusing on herself. At first it felt strange, unnatural even, to not be constantly worried about what her parents needed or what Emily was going through. But then, slowly, the space Sarah had created in her life began to feel like a breath of fresh air. The pressure that had suffocated her for so many years was lifting, and for the first time she felt like she could think clearly. Sarah decided it was time to make a plan for herself. A plan that didn't involve carrying everyone's burdens, a plan where she could build a future that was hers and hers alone. She started by looking at her finances. Over the years, she had set aside money in savings, but much of it had been spent on her family's expenses. She had made financial sacrifices for them, and now she was ready to rebuild. She set clear goals, paying off her debts, saving for her future, and investing in herself, whether that meant furthering her education or exploring passions she had put on hold for so long. Sarah also realized that part of her healing process involved cutting out the toxic relationships that had drained her. It wasn't just about her family's financial dependence on her, it was about their emotional manipulation as well. They had always relied on Sarah to hold things together, but they had never considered the cost to her. No one had ever checked in on her, asked if she was okay, or offered to help. It had always been about them, their needs, their struggles. For the first time, Sarah decided to put herself first. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, she pulled out a notebook and began to write. The first words that appeared on the page were simple. I am not responsible for their happiness. She wrote it again and again. It was a mantra, a reminder that she had spent far too long carrying the weight of others. But no more. She was done being the person who was always expected to sacrifice, to give, to fix things. She had given enough. Sarah's plan was simple but deliberate. First, she would focus on her career. She was a talented financial analyst, and she knew she had the skills to take her business to the next level. She had been too distracted by family drama to focus on her own growth. Now it was time to make her career a priority. She updated her portfolio, began networking more, and took on new clients. With each step forward, Sarah felt more confident, more in control of her own life. The second part of her plan was to focus on personal growth. She joined a local art class, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. She started taking long walks around the city, reconnecting with herself and the world around her. She explored new hobbies and met new people who didn't know her as the fixer, the one who always gave without asking for anything in return. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was living for herself. And perhaps most importantly, Sarah set boundaries. She didn't pick up the phone when her family called. She didn't respond to Emily's text messages, which had begun to become more desperate as time went on. She realised that her family's manipulation of her time and energy would never end unless she took a stand. And taking a stand meant not giving in. She had to learn to say no. No to the guilt, no to the manipulation, and most importantly, no to the idea that she had to be the one to hold everything together. It wasn't easy. There were days when Sarah found herself staring at her phone, wondering if she should pick up and just end the tension. She missed her parents, missed the old times when things felt simpler, when she was just their daughter, not their emotional crutch. But then she remembered why she had made the decision in the first place. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. Sarah's resolve was tested when Emily called her again, her voice almost pleading. "Please, Sarah," Emily said. "We're falling apart without you. Mum and Dad are a mess. You can't just abandon us like this." Sarah's stomach twisted at the sound of her sister's voice. It was the same old manipulative tone, the one that made Sarah feel guilty for every decision she had ever made. But this time, Sarah didn't cave. She took a deep breath and spoke slowly, with the kind of clarity that only came from truly understanding her own worth. "I'm not abandoning you, Emily. I'm just choosing not to be the one who holds this family together anymore. I've done that for years, and it's never been enough. I'm done being the one who sacrifices everything for you. You need to figure this out without me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Emily spoke again, her voice was a bit more strained. "You're really done with us, aren't you?" "I'm not done with you, Emily," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But I am done sacrificing my life for you. I have to live for me now." The call ended soon after, and Sarah put the phone down, feeling the weight of her decision lift a little more. She was finally living for herself. She was finally taking control. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt at peace with her decision. She had chosen herself, and that was all that mattered. She wasn't going to live her life in the shadow of her family's needs anymore. She was going to build a future for herself, a future where she could be happy, successful, and free. It had only been a few weeks since Sarah's final conversation with her family, but already the fallout was beginning to feel like a storm that couldn't be avoided. Emily's first attempt to get Sarah to help had failed, but this time she wasn't giving up so easily. The phone calls, the guilt trips, the accusations, all of it had been met with Sarah's calm resolve, but now Emily had taken things to a new level. One morning, Sarah woke up to a notification on her phone. A new email had arrived. It was from a lawyer's office. Her heart skipped a beat, as she opened it, reading the subject line. Legal complaint, Emily Perry v. Sarah Perry. Her hands trembled as she read through the email. Emily had filed a lawsuit against her, accusing Sarah of fraudulent inducement in the contract related to the family business. The claim was that Sarah had manipulated Emily into signing over 60% of the business in exchange for a loan that Emily had never agreed to. The email outlined the legal action, demanding that Sarah hand over her shares in the business or face further legal action. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. She had been prepared for this, had known that Emily wouldn't just walk away without a fight. But the audacity of the accusation shook her. Fraudulent inducement? How could Emily, after everything Sarah had done for her, accuse her of such a thing? For a moment, doubt crept in. Could Emily actually have a case? Was this truly what she had become in the eyes of her family, someone who had taken what didn't belong to her? But the more Sarah thought about it, the clearer the truth became. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't coerced Emily into anything. In fact, she had saved her family and their business. Sarah had been the one to take out a loan to keep the business afloat during its darkest hours. She had been the one to negotiate with creditors and secure the financial stability of a company that was on the brink of bankruptcy. And in return for all of her efforts, she had secured a stake in the business, a fair stake, one that had been documented with legal contracts and witnessed by professionals. There had been nothing fraudulent about it. The more Sarah thought about the situation, the more she realised something else. Emily's attempt to accuse her of fraud wasn't just a legal strategy, it was an act of desperation. Emily was trying to turn the tables, trying to claim the business back from Sarah because she was now seeing the consequences of her own actions. Emily's need for control had blinded her to the fact that she was the one who had benefited from Sarah's sacrifices. And now when the financial tide had turned, she was trying to take back everything she had given up so easily. Sarah wasn't just angry, she was determined. She would not allow Emily to manipulate her one more time. This was her moment, not just to defend her stake in the business, but to finally stand up for everything she had worked for. The first thing Sarah did was gather all the documents she had related to the family business. She pulled out the contracts she had signed when she took on ownership, the emails exchanged with Emily and the other stakeholders, and the bank statements showing the loans she had taken to keep the business alive. Every detail, every transaction, Sarah had kept records. She had learned early on to protect herself, to document every step she had taken to help her family, because she knew that one day she might need proof. She called her lawyer, Karen Hull, the same lawyer who had helped her with the initial legal paperwork for the business years ago. Karen was no-nonsense, sharp and efficient. Everything Sarah needed right now. "I'm ready to fight this, Karen," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I've got all the documentation we need. It's all legitimate. I didn't steal anything from Emily. I saved the damn business." Karen's voice came through with reassuring clarity. "I've been through the contract, Sarah. You're in a strong position. The business was on the brink of failure, and you were the one who saved it. This lawsuit is nothing more than a scare tactic. We'll file for dismissal, and if they want to go to court, we'll have the proof to back you up." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't just a bystander in this fight. She had built her case, and she was going to win. Emily's accusations would not stand. A few days later, Sarah found herself sitting in a conference room, her lawyer at her side, facing Emily's legal team. Emily's lawyer was trying to spin a narrative that portrayed Sarah as a villain, someone who had manipulated her own family for personal gain. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. As the lawyer presented their case, Sarah calmly laid out the truth, presenting her documentation one piece at a time. The contract she had signed in 2015, the loan papers she had taken out to save the business, and the emails she had sent to the bank. All of it was clear evidence of her commitment to the family. She hadn't taken anything from Emily. She had saved everything. And now, as the case unfolded, Sarah felt a surge of pride. She wasn't just defending her financial stake in the business, she was defending her integrity, her years of sacrifice, and her right to claim what was hers. The final twist in the case came when Sarah's lawyer presented a key piece of evidence, a letter from the bank showing that Emily's business had been in the red, with overdue payments and a risk of bankruptcy, until Sarah had stepped in and secured a loan to cover the debts. Emily's attempts to portray Sarah as a villain crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The case was dismissed, and Emily's claims of fraud were thrown out. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the final ruling. The tension that had hung thick in the air for weeks seemed to hang in the room for one final moment before the decision was announced. Sarah sat at the table with her lawyer, Karen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known all along that her case was strong, that the evidence was on her side, but hearing it aloud, hearing the judge confirm her legal right to the business, it still hit her with a surge of relief and disbelief. The judge's voice was calm as she spoke, but the words were clear. The contract signed by the defendant, Sarah Perry, is valid. The claims of fraudulent inducement filed by the plaintiff, Emily Perry, are dismissed with prejudice. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as the weight of the victory settled in. It was over. Emily's attempts to take back the business had failed. Case dismissed, the judge concluded, and just like that, it was done. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realised she had been holding. The relief was immediate but fleeting. She was no longer facing the crushing weight of her sister's accusations, no longer battling to keep her family's betrayal from drowning her. But as the reality of the victory settled in, Sarah couldn't shake the emptiness that came with it. As the room began to empty, Sarah stood up slowly, gathering her things. Karen gave her a quick, reassuring smile. "You did great. This is a win, Sarah. You fought for what's yours." But Sarah didn't feel the joy she thought she would. She had won, yes, she had fought for her rights, for her stake in the business, but the victory felt hollow. Her family's silence, the coldness they had shown her through this whole process, still lingered like a heavy fog. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah was met with the usual stares and whispers. Her family hadn't shown up for the hearing, and she hadn't expected them to. They hadn't acknowledged her throughout the entire ordeal, not once asking how she was holding up or showing any concern for her well-being. They hadn't even tried to contact her since the initial fight. Sarah had expected them to be angry, to be bitter, but the silence was worse. The absence of their voices, their demands, was deafening. She had won her battle, but the cost of that victory weighed heavily on her. As she walked out of the courthouse, she stopped for a moment to collect herself. The noise of the city swirled around her, but she stood still, staring at the pavement. What now? What was left for her? She had stood up for herself, taken back control, but it hadn't brought her the peace she had imagined. All of her efforts to protect her family, to keep them afloat, had been met with rejection. Even now, after the legal battle had ended in her favour, they were still distant, still unwilling to acknowledge her sacrifice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Sarah glanced down. It was a message from her mother. For the first time since the dinner, there was an attempt at communication. "We've heard the ruling. You've won. But why did it have to go this far, Sarah? Why couldn't you just help us? We're your family." The words were like a knife to her chest. The tone was exactly as she had feared. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a recognition of what she had done for them all these years. It was just another attempt to make her feel guilty for standing up for herself. Another attempt to pull her back into their world. A world where her needs never mattered. A world where her sacrifice was expected, not appreciated. Sarah typed a response, her fingers hesitating over the keys. She wanted to say so much. She wanted to tell her mother everything. The years of sacrifices, the money she had given up, the emotional labour she had poured into their lives. But she didn't. Instead, she typed, "I did this for me, not for you. I need to live my own life now." She stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. It felt final, and yet it didn't bring the satisfaction she expected. It was a victory, yes, but not the kind she had imagined. As she walked away from the courthouse, Sarah felt a deep sense of emptiness. She had won, but the prize didn't feel sweet. The legal victory hadn't brought her the recognition, the gratitude, or the love she had always wanted from her family. In fact, it had only reinforced what she had known all along, that her family would never truly see her. They would never understand the sacrifices she had made or the cost of her love for them. Sarah had hoped that standing up for herself would bring her peace, that it would finally heal the wounds that had been festering for years. But as she stood alone on the steps of the courthouse, she realized that true peace might not come from the validation of her family or from any legal victory. True peace, she understood, would come from within. It would come from learning to love herself, from living her life on her own terms, not for anyone else but for her. Her victory in the courtroom had been necessary. It had been important for her to stand up for what was hers, for what she had earned, but it was only the first step. The real work, the real healing, would come from accepting that her worth was not defined by what she had given to others. She was more than the sacrifices she had made. She was Sarah, strong, capable, and deserving of a life that was hers to live. As she walked down the steps of the courthouse and into the bustling streets, Sarah felt the weight of the world lighten just a little. She was ready to move forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time she felt like she was heading in the right direction. After the court battle, after the silence from her family, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of a life she had never truly known, a life of freedom. The weight of years of sacrifice, of being the invisible one, was lifting slowly, but it was still there, lingering. For so long she had been living for everyone else. Now, for the first time, she had the space to breathe, to think, and to decide who she wanted to be. The first few days were a mix of overwhelming emotions. There was the relief, of course, the sweet satisfaction of knowing she was no longer shackled by her family's needs, the constant pull on her time and resources. But there was also the loneliness that crept in, the quiet void left by the absence of family contact. Her phone sat on the counter, untouched, and Sarah couldn't decide if she was grateful for the silence or if it made her feel more isolated. One afternoon, while sitting at her kitchen table, she looked around her small but cosy apartment, really looked at it for the first time. The walls were bare, save for a few photos of places she had travelled to in the past, before life had gotten in the way. The shelves were sparsely filled, and there was a definite lack of decoration. It wasn't that she didn't have the ability to make her living space beautiful, but in the years of sacrifice, Sarah had never taken the time to make it hers. It had always been a space to crash in between working, helping, and caring for her family. Now, though, it was hers, and for the first time Sarah felt a spark of excitement. She wasn't just existing anymore, she was starting to live. She enrolled in an art class, something she had always wanted to do but had never allowed herself to pursue. Growing up, Sarah had always found solace in drawing and painting. It was her escape, her way to express the feelings she couldn't put into words. But in the rush of adult responsibilities, it had become something she left behind. Now, she was finally picking up the brushes again. The first few weeks in the art class were nerve-wracking. Sarah had always been her own harshest critic, and sitting in front of a canvas, not knowing where to start, felt daunting. But as the weeks passed, something beautiful started to emerge. The colours on her canvas became an extension of her emotions, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was in control of something. The stress, the worry, the years of emotional weight, all of it poured into her artwork, and for the first time it felt good. She was creating something for herself, something that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. But it wasn't just art that was making Sarah feel like herself again. She started making plans. She took up hiking on weekends, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. The long walks through the wooded trails helped clear her mind, and each step felt like a step away from the past, from the years she had spent making herself small for the sake of her family. At night, after her hikes and after her painting classes, she would sit down with a book, sometimes a novel, sometimes poetry, anything that filled her soul with something other than obligation. The simple pleasures of being alone, of being herself, became a refuge, a space where she didn't have to carry anyone else's burdens. She wasn't the fixer anymore. She wasn't the silent supporter. She was Sarah, the woman who could live for herself. Then one evening, after a particularly fulfilling day spent at the art studio and a long walk, Sarah found herself sitting on the balcony of her apartment, the evening sky painted in shades of purple and gold. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the faint sound of people talking on the street below, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to rush anywhere. She had time to just be. It was then that the truth hit her, as sudden and clear as a thunderclap. Freedom wasn't about leaving her family behind. It wasn't about severing ties and running away from the past. It was about living without the burden of their expectations. It wasn't about rejecting them. It was about reclaiming her own life. She didn't have to give up on them to find herself. She simply had to stop letting their needs define who she was. For so long, Sarah had believed that family meant sacrifice. She had been taught that love was about putting everyone else first, about being the one to hold everything together. But that idea had nearly destroyed her. Now she realized that true love wasn't about self-sacrifice. It was about balance. It was about loving yourself enough to say no when you needed to, and it was about not losing yourself in the process of helping others. Sarah wasn't abandoning her family by choosing herself. She was giving them the opportunity to grow, to stand on their own, just as she had finally done. Her decision wasn't about turning her back on them. It was about finally facing forward and stepping into her own life. She felt a wave of peace wash over her. For the first time in years, she was not just surviving, she was living. She wasn't carrying anyone else's burdens. She was free. And in that freedom, Sarah found joy in the simplest things. A quiet morning with a cup of coffee, a brushstroke on a canvas, the warmth of the sun on her face during her walks. She was no longer waiting for approval. She wasn't waiting for her family's validation. She had finally learned to live for herself, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. Sarah spent the following months immersed in a life that felt entirely new to her. It wasn't just the physical changes she'd made, her new hobbies, the art classes, the hikes, or even the decision to take weekends off from everything that once consumed her. It was the internal shift, the transformation of how she saw herself and the world around her that felt the most profound. For so long, she had defined herself through the lens of her family's needs. She had been the one who fixed things, who sacrificed, who gave without expecting anything in return. Her worth had been rooted in her ability to be needed, to be the rock upon which everyone else stood. But now, for the first time, she was building her worth on her own terms, and it felt liberating. One evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her brushes and paints scattered in front of her. She had just finished a canvas, a swirling mix of blues, greens, and yellows that reflected the inner peace she was starting to feel. As she looked at the painting, she smiled, recognizing that it was more than just colours on a canvas. It was her journey, her transformation. It was the representation of the freedom she had gained, the space she had carved out for herself. But that freedom, as she had come to realize, wasn't about rejecting her family or running away from her past. It wasn't about cutting ties and pretending they didn't matter. Instead, it was about living in a way that wasn't dictated by their expectations, a way where she could still love them without losing herself in the process. The more Sarah spent time focusing on herself, the more she realized just how deeply her family had shaped her sense of identity. For years, her role had been to serve them, to fill the gaps, to be the problem solver, to carry their burdens without question. The weight of their expectations had been a constant companion. But now, with the space to reflect, Sarah understood that she didn't need to carry their load in order to love them. She didn't have to be the one who always stepped in to save the day. In fact, she had been robbing them of the opportunity to grow and learn on their own. By stepping back, by no longer acting as the emotional and financial support beam of the family, Sarah was giving them the chance to stand on their own 2 feet. And as much as it pained her, she had to accept that her family might never fully understand or appreciate the magnitude of what she had done for them. They had always taken her for granted, expecting her to be there, always the reliable one, the one who never asked for anything. They wouldn't see it, and they might never see it, but that was no longer her problem. One day, while sitting at the art studio, Sarah overheard a conversation between 2 of her classmates. They were talking about how their families had shaped their own identities and how difficult it was to break free from the roles they had been assigned. Sarah listened, a smile tugging at her lips. She understood now, more than ever, that freedom wasn't about cutting ties with the past. It was about taking control of the present. It was about choosing to live for herself, regardless of what others expected or wanted from her. Sarah realized that by stepping into this new version of herself, she wasn't betraying her family. She wasn't abandoning them. She was finally honoring her own life, her own dreams. She could love her family from a distance, and in doing so, she was showing them how to love her in return, not because of what she could do for them, but because of who she was. For the first time, Sarah was asking herself the question she had avoided for so long. Who am I when I'm not trying to fix everyone else's problems? In the process, she also began to forgive herself for the years she had spent giving up her own happiness for the sake of her family. It wasn't that she regretted helping them, it was that she had forgotten how to help herself. She had allowed their needs to consume her, to define her. Now, she was rediscovering who she was beyond the roles they had assigned her. Sarah's new life wasn't perfect. It wasn't free of challenges. She still missed the closeness she had once had with her family, and there were days when the absence of their presence felt like a gaping hole in her heart. But she had learned something valuable. True freedom wasn't about distance. It was about living without the chains of others' expectations. The more Sarah leaned into her own independence, the more she began to see that freedom wasn't a destination. It was a journey. Every day, every choice she made to live for herself, to pursue her dreams, was a step closer to the woman she was meant to be. And for the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't perfect. She still struggled with guilt, especially when she thought about her family. But she was learning to let go of the need for validation from them. She was learning to forgive herself for the years she had spent hiding behind their needs. And she was starting to believe more and more that her happiness could come from within, that her worth didn't have to be tied to what others expected from her. As she stood in front of her easel one evening, finishing a new piece, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The painting was abstract, the colours bold and vivid, just like the new life she was creating for herself. She took a step back, admiring the work, and for the first time in years, she felt truly proud of something she had created, something that was entirely hers. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of that piece. She wasn't the fixer anymore. She was Sarah. And that was enough. Sarah had come a long way from the woman who had once bent under the weight of her family's expectations. Now she was standing at the podium of a women's conference on resilience and leadership, ready to share her story. It had been a few months since the legal battle had concluded, and while things with her family had remained distant, Sarah had found a new sense of purpose. The conference was being held in a small but vibrant community centre in Charleston, and as Sarah stood behind the microphone, she could feel a mix of excitement and nervousness in her chest. She had always been a quiet person, someone who preferred to stay in the background, but this was different. This time she wasn't hiding behind anyone's expectations. She was speaking for herself, for the woman she had become after all the pain and sacrifice. Her journey to this point had not been easy. It had taken her months of painful reflection, cutting ties with family, and finally accepting that her worth wasn't tied to how much she could give to others. She had struggled to find her own identity, separate from the roles she had played for so long. But now, as she looked out at the audience, she realized that every step she had taken had led her here. She was ready to speak her truth. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "I've spent most of my life being the one who took care of everyone," she started, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I thought that's what love was, giving everything you have, even if it means losing yourself in the process. But I was wrong. I had been so busy taking care of everyone else that I forgot to take care of myself. I forgot that I had dreams, that I deserved to live my life for me." Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every person in the audience hanging on her words. For the first time, Sarah felt truly seen, not as the fixer, the helper, or the one who always came through for everyone. She was simply Sarah, the woman who had fought for herself. "It wasn't easy," Sarah continued. "When I finally decided to step away, to stop being the one who held everything together for my family, I was met with resistance. They didn't understand. They thought I was being selfish, that I was abandoning them. But I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was choosing to live for myself, and that was the hardest thing I've ever done." Her voice shook for a moment, but she steadied herself. "I had to let go of the idea that my worth was tied to how much I could give. I had to stop being the one who fixed everything. And you know what? That was the most freeing thing I've ever done." The audience was still, hanging on every word. Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to the women listening to her story. She wasn't alone in this. They all understood what it felt like to give too much, to be weighed down by the needs of others, to lose themselves in the process. She wasn't just sharing her story, she was sharing a message that resonated with so many. "I thought I had to sacrifice everything for my family. I thought that's what love was. But I've learned that love doesn't mean losing yourself. Love means standing up for yourself, setting boundaries, and knowing that you deserve happiness too." Sarah took a deep breath, letting the words wash over her. She wasn't just speaking to the audience, she was speaking to herself as well. This was the woman she had become. The woman who could stand up for herself, who could live her life without feeling guilty for choosing her own happiness. The twist came when Sarah realized that, despite all the challenges, despite the estrangement from her family, she had finally found peace. Her family might never understand her decision. They might never recognize the sacrifices she had made. But she no longer needed their approval. She had built a life for herself, a life that was hers to live on her own terms. "The truth is," Sarah said, her voice strong now, "I used to think that in order to be a good person, I had to give everything away. I had to fix things for everyone, even if it meant losing myself. But now I know that the greatest gift I can give is to live authentically, to honor myself and my own needs. I can still love my family from a distance, but I don't have to be their emotional crutch anymore." As she finished speaking, Sarah looked out at the audience and saw the tears in their eyes, the nods of recognition. She had shared a piece of herself, and in doing so had touched the hearts of so many. The applause that followed was not just for her strength or her story, it was for the resilience of every woman in the room who had ever felt like they weren't enough, like they had to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others. Sarah left the stage that day with a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had shared her truth, and in doing so had helped others see their own strength. But most importantly, she had finally found peace within herself. She no longer felt the need to prove her worth by fixing everyone else's problems. She had learned that her value came from who she was, not from what she could give. That evening, as Sarah sat in her quiet apartment reflecting on the day, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. She was no longer running from the past or from her family's expectations. She had made peace with them, with her choices, and most importantly, with herself. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to truly rest. She was no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's burdens. She was free to live her life for herself, to pursue her dreams, and to find happiness on her own terms. And that, she realized, was the truest form of freedom. As Sarah left the conference hall, she felt a profound sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The speech, the words, the emotional connection with the audience, it had all been part of her journey. But the real transformation had happened within herself. She had spent so much of her life measuring her worth by what she could do for others. And today she had spoken to a room full of women who understood her pain, her journey, and her triumphs. For the first time in a long time, Sarah wasn't just the quiet one sitting in the background. She was a voice, her voice, and it had been heard. Walking down the steps of the building, Sarah noticed how the city felt different, how the air seemed fresher. It was as if the weight of years of guilt, of trying to please her family, had finally lifted. She wasn't burdened by the expectations of others anymore. The clarity she felt was liberating. But as much as she had spoken about her freedom, Sarah knew that true freedom wasn't about getting away from her family. It was about releasing herself from the need to carry their burdens. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued to explore her own path. She dove deeper into her artwork, using the paintings not just as a form of self-expression, but as a way to reclaim her lost pieces. Each stroke of the brush was an act of defiance against the years of living for others. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She was enough, just as she was. But even in her personal growth, Sarah faced moments of doubt. There were times when she would check her phone, waiting for a message or a call from her parents or Emily. Would they finally reach out to apologize? Would they finally recognize what she had done for them all those years? And every time the phone remained silent, a pang of loneliness would settle in. She had made peace with the fact that they might never fully understand her decision, but the silence still stung. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in her apartment, the phone rang. It was a call she had been expecting for weeks but hadn't truly prepared for. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Should she answer? What would this call be? Was it another attempt to make her feel guilty for her choices? With a deep breath, Sarah swiped the screen and answered. Sarah. Her mother's voice came softly through the phone, tinged with exhaustion. I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I wanted to reach out. Sarah listened carefully, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She could tell that her mother had been crying. There was an unfamiliar vulnerability in her voice, and for a moment it reminded Sarah of the person she had always wanted her mother to be, the one who could see her, who could understand her. I've been thinking about everything, her mother continued, about you, about how much you've done for this family, and I just want you to know that I see it. I see how much you've sacrificed. I'm sorry we never told you how much we appreciated it. For a moment, Sarah was silent. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not from her mother, who had always been so wrapped up in Emily's life. But here it was, coming from her mother's broken voice. Sarah could feel the years of tension melting away, even as the weight of those years still lingered in her heart. I know I can't change the past, her mother said quietly, and I know I can't undo the hurt. But I want you to know that I love you. And I want to start over. I want to find a way for us to heal. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened. It wasn't the apology she had expected, but it was enough. It was a start. It was the acknowledgement she had longed for, the recognition of her sacrifices and her worth, not just as the fixer, but as her own person. But Sarah knew deep down that this was not the moment for her to return to the family dynamic that had caused her so much pain. This was the moment to forgive, to release the bitterness, but to still hold firm to her decision to live for herself. "I appreciate your words, Mom," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm her. "And I love you too. But I can't go back to the way things were. I have to keep living for me now. And I need you to understand that." Her mother's silence spoke volumes, but Sarah didn't feel the need to fill it. For the first time, she wasn't apologizing for her decision. She wasn't backing down. She was standing in her truth. The conversation ended with promises to keep in touch, but Sarah didn't feel the need to rush. She had found peace in her decision. She wasn't going to be the one to fix her family's problems anymore. She wasn't going to return to the patterns that had stifled her for so long, but she would always carry love for them from a distance. That night, Sarah sat on her balcony again, the cool breeze against her skin, looking out over the city. It was late, but the stars were bright above her, and the hum of life continued on below. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was rushing to make a decision or change the course of her life. She was simply living, and that was enough.